before the Pharaohs. Lost civilizations before empires. The lost megacities of old Europe. In 3700 BC, the largest city on Earth was not in Egypt. It was not in Mesopotamia. It was in what is now Ukraine, and it housed more than 15,000 people. For over a century, Western history placed the origins of urban civilization firmly in the Middle East. Sumer, Babylon, Egypt. That story is incomplete, and archaeology has known it for decades. The evidence was always there. It was simply being asked the wrong questions, in the wrong languages, by scholars who had never heard of the forest steppe of Eastern Europe. Hidden beneath the wheat fields of modern Ukraine, forgotten for 6,000 years, the Trypillian mega-settlements were not merely among the largest urban concentrations on Earth. They were one of the earliest urban experiments our species ever attempted. Built a full millennium before Mesopotamia's Uruk, before Egypt's Memphis, before any city that appears in the history books your teachers used. Constructed without kings, sustained without bronze, and decorated with an art so startlingly beautiful, it still stops archaeologists cold. They covered up to 320 hectares. They housed tens of thousands of ordinary people. And every few generations, they burned everything to the ground, on purpose. The ash layers are still there, preserved in the Ukrainian soil, waiting to be understood. Drawing on the latest magnetometry surveys, ancient DNA research, and decades of Eastern European archaeology unavailable to Western readers. Before the Pharaohs reconstructs the daily lives, beliefs, social structures, and ultimate disappearance of a civilization that rewrites everything we thought we knew about the origins of human urbanism. Not from legend, not from speculation, from soil samples, isotope analysis, burned clay, and floor plans that have survived 6 millennia underground. A people who lived in cities of 10,000 souls and left not a single king's name behind. Chapter 1. The City That Should Not Exist. A photograph that broke the map. In the late 1970s, a Soviet archaeologist named Mikhailo Shmagly was handed a stack of aerial reconnaissance photographs of Ukrainian farmland. He was not supposed to find anything extraordinary. He found the largest city in prehistoric Europe. The photographs were black and white, slightly grainy, taken from a small reconnaissance aircraft banking over the flat collective farm fields of the Cherkasy region in central Ukraine. From altitude, the land looked unremarkable in every direction. Parallel furrows of recent plowing, the occasional woodlot, a dirt road dissolving into the horizon. Nothing to stop the eye. Shmagly spread the photographs across a table and leaned in close. There, pressed into the dark Ukrainian soil like a watermark in ancient paper, were lines, curves actually, enormous, sweeping arcs of subtly discolored earth that only became visible from altitude, where the eye could finally take in their scale. The arcs nested inside one another, ring after ring after ring, each one hundreds of meters across, all of them curving around a vast empty center. Too regular to be geology, too enormous to be a village, too deliberate to be anything but intentional. Shmagly had spent his career studying the Trypillia culture, a prehistoric civilization that had flourished on these plains thousands of years before the birth of Christ. He knew the culture produced large settlements. He had excavated them. But what the photographs showed near the village of Talianki was not a large settlement. The outermost ring of structures alone enclosed more than 400 hectares. The density of building outlines within those rings suggested not dozens of structures, not hundreds, but potentially thousands. He was looking at a city, a real city, one that, by every rule of Western historical understanding, should not have existed at all. Because according to everything archaeology had taught the world, cities did not appear in prehistoric Europe. Cities appeared in Mesopotamia, in Sumer, in Egypt. Not here. Not in the Ukrainian steppe. Not this early. The documents record the discovery. They do not record the exact emotional weather of the man who made it. But we can infer something from what happened next. Shmagly spent the rest of his career trying to understand what he had found. He was not alone. The photograph he was holding would eventually force an entire field of scholarship to reconsider one of its most fundamental assumptions about where human civilization began, the civilization that rewrote the timeline. Here is the story most of us were taught. Civilization began in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE. The Sumerians invented cities, then came Egypt, the Indus Valley, China. Europe, meanwhile, was a backwater of tribal farmers who would not produce anything resembling urban civilization for another 2,000 years. It is a clean story. It appears in textbooks on every continent, and it is, at minimum, radically incomplete. The Trypillia culture, known in Romanian and Moldovan scholarship as the Cucuteni culture, and jointly as the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture in international academic usage, flourished across a vast territory centered on what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and northeastern Romania, from approximately 5,400 BCE to 2,700 BCE. Nearly 3,000 years of continuous civilization, longer than the entire span from ancient Rome to today. At its peak, between roughly 4,100 and 3,300 BCE, this culture was building settlements that were, by any reasonable measure, the largest in the world. Not the largest in Europe, the largest on Earth. The site at Talianki that Schmagli's photographs were beginning to reveal covers approximately 450 hectares, roughly 1,100 acres. Magnetometry surveys conducted decades later would identify more than 2,700 individual structures within that area. Estimates of the population vary among scholars, and the uncertainty is real. Most researchers propose between 10,000 and 20,000 inhabitants for the largest Trypillian mega-settlements, with significant assumptions built into any specific figure. But even at the conservative end, Talianki was a metropolis by any ancient standard. Consider the comparison. Uruk, the Sumerian city that textbooks call the world's first, reached its peak population of perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 around 3000 BCE. Memphis, one of Egypt's great capitals, held perhaps 30,000 at its early height. Both of these cities arrived after the Trypillian mega-settlements were already established and thriving, in some cases by more than 1,000 years. The people who built Talianki and Maidanetski did so without a single scrap of written language, without bronze tools, and without, as far as we can currently determine, a king. They did it anyway. The question is, how? The land that made them possible. To feed a city of 15,000 people without metal plows, without wheeled carts, without writing to organize supply chains, that is not a logistics problem. It is a near impossibility. The fact that the Trypillians solved it repeatedly across centuries tells you something fundamental about the place they chose to do it in. The territory they inhabited sits at the western edge of the Pontic steppe, the vast grassland corridor stretching from Central Asia to the Carpathian foothills. But the Trypillian heartland was not the open steppe itself. It was the forest steppe transition zone, river valleys and wooded uplands cut through by the southern bug, the Dnieper, the Dniester, the Prut, and beneath all of it, the famous Ukrainian cornism, the black earth, the most fertile soil on the planet, layered so deep and so rich that even after millennia of cultivation, it still produces a significant fraction of the world's grain today. In the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, before any of that depletion, it was something close to agricultural paradise. The rivers connected everything. They were highways before roads existed, corridors for trade, migration, and the flow of ideas across hundreds of kilometers. The Trypillians built their settlements on the elevated terraces above the floodplains, where they could farm the rich bottomland, draw water from below, watch the surrounding landscape, and stay dry in spring floods. This was not random. After nearly 3,000 years of accumulated agricultural knowledge, these communities understood their landscape with the precision of long experience. The climate helped. The Atlantic period of the Holocene, the era of the Trypillian peak, was somewhat warmer and wetter than today. The forests were denser, the rivers fuller. Wild game was abundant. Fish filled the rivers, and the cornism, untouched by the intensive agriculture that would later reduce parts of it to dust, yielded harvests that would seem implausible to a modern farmer without chemical inputs. The land rewarded investment, it rewarded knowledge, it rewarded, in particular, the willingness to stay in one place and learn it deeply, which is, when you think about it, the precondition for building cities at all. But here is the puzzle the land also created. The same fertility that allowed these mega settlements to grow also imposed a hard limit on how long they could stay. Intensive cereal cultivation without crop rotation depletes soil nitrogen. A city of 10,000 people eating from the same hinterland eventually exhausts it. The Trypillians knew this. The pattern of their settlements, periodically abandoned and relocated, suggests a community that understood the carrying capacity of its land and planned around it. Whether that knowledge also explains why they burned their cities before leaving is one of the central mysteries this book will return to. Why nobody knew. Here is the second mystery, and in some ways it is stranger than the first. How did a civilization that built the largest cities in prehistoric Europe remain almost completely unknown in the Western world for most of the 20th century? The Trypillia culture was not lost to history. It was lost to language barriers and political geography. In the 1890s, a Czech-born archaeologist named Vikenty Koika, working in the soil near Kyiv, then part of the Russian Empire, began noticing something beneath the fields: painted pottery sherds and fired clay floors, unlike anything previously documented in the region. He had stumbled onto a civilization. His discoveries attracted serious scholarly attention. They were published, studied, expanded upon for decades. The problem was where that scholarship lived. In Ukrainian and Russian journals that Western European and American researchers rarely read and could not always access even when they tried. Then came the Iron Curtain. For most of the 20th century, it was not merely a political border. It was an epistemological one. Decades of extraordinary Soviet and Ukrainian archaeological work on Trypillian sites was effectively invisible to Western scholarship. The books that shaped how educated people in America and Western Europe understood prehistoric humanity were written by researchers whose mental map of the ancient world was built entirely from Near Eastern and Western European evidence. In that map, there was simply no space for cities on the Ukrainian steppe. The possibility was not rejected. It was never considered. The result is a striking asymmetry that persists to this day. In Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, the Trypillia and Cucuteni cultures are foundational, taught in schools, displayed in national museums, woven into cultural identity. In the United States and most of Western Europe, they remain virtually unknown outside specialist circles. Ask a well-educated person to name the world's oldest cities, and they will say Uruk, Jericho, Memphis. They will not say Talyenki. Most have never heard the word. That is changing faster now than at any point in the past century. Magnetometry surveys in the 2000s and 2010s produced settlement maps of such scale and clarity that the wider archaeological community could not look away. Collaborative projects between Ukrainian researchers and teams from Britain and Germany brought the mega settlements into English language discourse with new urgency. Ancient DNA studies, which have transformed the entire field of prehistoric archaeology since roughly 2015, place the Trypillian genetic legacy directly inside the story of how modern Europeans came to be who they are. The city that was not supposed to exist is now impossible to ignore. What archaeology is piecing together, piece by carbonized piece, is a picture of prehistoric urban life more complex and more human than anything the old textbooks allowed. The question beneath the ruins. Stand in your imagination in a field near the village of Talyenki. The soil is the color of dark chocolate. In spring, after plowing, it smells of iron and rain. The land is flat here at the field's edge, then slopes gently toward a valley where a tributary of the southern Bug winds between stands of alder and willow. Larks rise from the grass. The sky over central Ukraine is enormous, a geographic fact that surprises every first-time visitor, because there is almost nothing to interrupt it. Somewhere beneath your feet, under 2 or 3 meters of accumulated earth, lie the floors of more than 2,000 houses. Beneath those floors, because Trypillian people sometimes buried special objects below their hearthstones, are figurines, ceramic vessels, animal bones. the traces of meals and prayers in ordinary mornings. In the dark soil are the carbonized remnants of grain, the dissolved profiles of wooden posts, the mineral ghosts of painted walls, an entire world compressed into the earth, waiting. Who were these people? How did they feed a city of tens of thousands without writing, without metal plows, without wheeled carts, or with only the most primitive versions of such things? How did they govern themselves? What did they believe about the sky and the dead and the meaning of fire? Why did they, generation after generation, build their cities to the same extraordinary plan, fill them with the same beautiful pottery, arrange the same figurines in the same corners of the same kinds of houses, and then, when the time came, burn everything to the ground? These are not small questions. They are, in fact, among the most fascinating questions in all of human history. And the answers, the ones archaeology has already uncovered, and the ones still buried in the black earth of Ukraine, are more surprising than anything you were taught to expect. The city that should not exist is waiting to tell its story.